During a course of interviews over the past year, we asked various people involved in the housing sector their thoughts on what makes community housing providers and CHPs so unique. This podcast is a brief summary of their accounts.
What is the difference between community housing and KO? I think the differences and the strength of community housing is that it can be anywhere within a community. KO tends not to be, for both historic reasons, but also because of the way in which economies of scale work. You know, it tends to cluster together groups of people, tends to be in large cities, etc., etc. There is some stuff going around, but community housing is always not just part of the community, but an active player within the community, and they can provide not only friendly landlord services, but a diversity of housing products, from ownership and shared ownership right through to affordable rent, right through to supported housing. That's something that is quite unique. Not every community housing organisation should do that, but the sector is a hugely diverse sector which can tailor itself to the immediate needs of its peoples and its places.
They have their fingers on things locally in the way that they can track people around and know people. So that's irreplaceable. But there is also a role for the government agencies to understand what issues they're dealing with. So I think it has to be a partnership. And I think if we start getting in, clear out and we can do it all by ourselves, but actually, even if people are doing it themselves, they need some capital, some infrastructure. And last time it was all, let's get rid of Housing New Zealand and we'll just have the community place. That lasted for a while, and then they didn't have any capital to actually maintain them. And so there's been negotiations sort of buying some of those back. It costs a lot of money to maintain a house, even if it's built well in the beginning.
If we're going to solve this housing crisis, it's got to be both. And our actions in government speak on that. That under our government over the last 6 years, we've seen more than 7,000 places delivered by the community housing sector. To put that in perspective, when we came into government, there were 5,000 places provided by this sector. There's today over 12,000. We've more than 5 times increased the amount of funding going in, so those homes can be operated with the kind of support that they need to be. But at the same token, we haven't seen that as an excuse of a dereliction of duty on the role of government either, that we've also been building. The problem and how we got into this mess is a decade before we had a government that said we're going to leave it to the community sector, we're not going to fund it properly, and the net result was 1,500 fewer houses when we got back into government than when we left the time before. Not only did we not build, but we actually lost public houses. So you can't say one or the other. My fear is what we're hearing again is a code for that dereliction of duty. What we had was our previous state-owned houses, by then Housing New Zealand, that some were sold to community housing providers, but some were just sold off. So when we got back into government, there were 1,500 fewer houses across both the community sector and the government than when we left office. Now, you'd expect over 9 years that there would have been some increase. So not only did we lose 1,500, but there was a failure to deliver. If the previous government had delivered at the rate we are, we'd have 20,000 more houses today than we do.
I think community housing has got a real strength in that we're based in local communities. And so we have an understanding of the community and that we know what kind of wraparound supports people need in order to sustain their tenancies. So I think what's different often between us and Kaingaora is the level of support, whether it be social service support, whether it be community development workers that are provided in the housing developments that we do. So, for example, if I think about, we've got a new housing development of 15 family homes. We bought a 16th house to use as a community house. We employ a community development worker who's in that house, and his job has really been to build neighbourhoods and build community between those different families. And it's really exciting to see what's happened.
We're big believers in the community housing sector. If you look at other countries, social and community housing is provided by a mixture of central government, the state, but also local community housing associations or local charities or non-profit institutions. In New Zealand, most of our social housing or community housing is provided by Kāinga Ora, which is a government-owned near monopoly. And one of the things the last national government put in place was a funding framework to allow the community sector to grow. And that's why you've seen a lot of community housing providers spring up in the last few years and obtain access to government rental support called the income related rent subsidy, for example. And that has proven really successful. And community housing providers tend to be more nimble, they tend to be more agile. You think of a group like the Salvation Army, for example, provide excellent wraparound pastoral care for people they're looking after. And there's a whole swathe of community housing providers around the country who do a great job. Some of them limited to particular communities, others of them more nationwide. So we want to put in place that funding framework and continue that funding framework to allow them to grow.
Yeah, I guess I think I'll start by prefacing that I think the community housing sector is maturing, but I think there's still some serious limitations. And I think that's more down to the government policy settings than down to the providers themselves. It was interesting to hear some of the comments this morning, particularly from Victoria Carroll, who was saying, well, when I've come to these in this past, these conferences are pretty white. And she was just being honest. And then she followed on with saying, but it's great to see how much this has shifted and to see the diversity in the room. And I felt encouraged by that too. I remember when I first sort of started being in this space, I did feel like it was very Pākehā dominated and all wonderful, well-meaning people who really care about the kaupapa. But it does something, or it distorts the conversation when you don't have the balance of demographics right. And it's the same with our elected representatives. When they don't represent the communities they serve, that's a problem. And I think that's true for those of us who are working in the community housing space if we don't appropriately reflect the demographics of those communities that we're working with and that we serve. Which is all to say that I think the role of community housing, and Kay Saville-Smith put forward some good provocations this morning, but I think the role of community housing really is to be these insiders who really know and understand the communities they work with, and they're able to tailor their approaches to be fit for purpose for those communities that they're working with. And I think they also have the social imperatives and the commitments to placemaking and forming strong community and facilitating great communities outcomes and being there all the way along. So they're not kind of just develop something and then be like, okay, well, over to you, best of luck. We're members of the community, we're committed to this community, and we're working together to both shape what it needs to be and how it looks and continues on into the future. So it's that sustained commitment and that deep knowledge and knowing of that specific community that I think differentiates community housing providers from others such as Kāinga Ora and also the private sector.
No, I definitely think everybody has a role, and I talk about this more specifically in the context of te tiriti, right, for tangata whenua, for Māori and for non-Māori, and the roles that different actors have either within those different spheres or in the relational together, working together. So there's different ways in which actors can contribute to, the diverse options that are available, whether it's for both Māori or non-Māori, and then for Māori that is by Māori, for Māori, right? So, and that can be both private actors and Māori. So there's a lot of partnerships. Everyone has a role in supporting them. And actually some of the most innovative solutions that I've seen have been between Māori and the private sector as well. So there's a lot of opportunity to collaborate and address a lot of these issues. But we were talking about earlier, these other elements that come into play, being able to have those wraparound services that many wouldn't have access to if it was just a, standalone home without that community. Thinking about cultural connections as well. And so thinking about reciprocity and building those things rather than, just living in isolation in your individual dwelling. So really fostering that collective kind of effort to ensure that people are connected and have a sense of belonging. So there's different ways in which, and I guess it depends who you talk to as well, who might prefer one or the other as well. So,
knowing your community. And this is what I said this morning about the importance of by Pacific for Pacific providers. We live it. If you looked at this morning, the Pacific speakers, even in the workshops, all of them had similar stories, got quite emotional about those stories, including the minister. And because we know what our realities are, the sacrifices our parents made that we can never forget. The vision was created from there. You know, the transiency, the fact we'd had to move several times before getting into home ownership. You know, the desires of our parents, our forefathers who wanted us to have somewhere stable that they could go to their graves peacefully knowing that we would be okay. And so that's what has fueled having that knowledge is really fueling our developments, because we know and we've been there. You know, we know what it's like to be poor. We know what it's like to be homeless. We know what it's like to be challenged and not know, where you're going to be staying at next, when the fear of when you're getting behind on rent and, fear of losing housing. And I think, always remembering that, always make sure that you work doubly hard to ensure that others don't have the experience that you've been through. I think within community housing providers, they're able to meet people where they're at, with all the issues that come, and have a hope of being able to support that. So that supportive wraparound supports for many, that perhaps organisations like Kāinga Ora don't have the capacity to, they're about providing public housing, they collect rent, they, make sure that people are housed and they have, they're well resourced to do that. But community providers, I think they have had to grow with the smell of an oily rag. Our organisation, we started off on $58,000. And, I always tell the story how the funder said to me, well, Roine, that's your foot in the door. And I said, I have a very big foot. And so, coming from that to where we are at now, and the sacrifices, and I know that that's what other community housing providers have had to do. And, I think also that they get a bad rap. It's almost like, that, if we see community housing providers becoming financially, stronger, they've been able to build their equity as organisations, we think that there's something sinister in it. But is that not what government expects of their own organisations? To be able to live within budgets, to be able to obtain surpluses where they need to obtain surpluses. So community housing providers don't have the luxury of an assured funding pool. Where the Kāinga Ora stuffs up the budget, government's not going to let them fall because they're their main vehicle. But if we do not live and practice within the confines of what we've been funded for and what we've said we'll do, the funding can be cut from government. And so we always live with the threat of those things, because at the end of the day, we don't hold the pūtea.
I think one of the key characteristics historically is they have been local in New Zealand, and I think that's really critical. And local doesn't mean you can't be a national provider, but you've got to somehow be local in that community. And most of our community housing providers are local, and even more so when you start to look at some of our iwi Māori providers. They're very local. It's dealing with specific issues and populations they know intimately, and I think that's pretty critical in how they work. I think the benefits of community housing provision is, while I'm a strong advocate of that regulatory model, you also have sovereignty within your organisation and with your decision making around what you're going to do. And that point I made earlier around, if the frameworks are set, you can then decide how you want to participate in that. That's critically important, because other entities, which are government entities, are always their master of the day changes and the policy positions change. And so as a result of that, what you end up doing is you move based on that political whim of, whim's been unkind because it's not a whim, but that political direction and where investment needs to go at any point in time. So as a community housing provider, you can take a longer term, often a generational view of what you're doing and what you're looking to provide. Your mission, if you like, being a mission-driven organisation, your mission is something that is sustained over a long time. And I think if you look at community housing organisations, they're not, and you look at what their mission vision statements have been, they tend to, well, some of the little bits of words might change. They tend to be, we're heading this is what we were set up for. This is our charitable purpose, if you like. You look at government organisations and it comes and goes. I'm not saying that they're not trying to achieve an objective, but the how often will change or the investment changes. So I think, so if you were investing, if you're looking for a way people to look at community housing providers, I think one, there's what they stand for, that they take an extremely long view, they are local and they understand the community and the need. They the way they operate and they do the business, the capability in those organisations has been built over many, many years and it has been sustained. So it's not you don't see organisations where there's not turnover, but when you look at the people that are in that place and playing in that space within the community housing sector, there's a huge depth of knowledge in there.
I think one of the unique things about Dwell and community housing providers is the relationships, the huge amount of relationships that we manage all the time, and not just manage, we relish them. They're just a core part of what we do. And that's just such a wide spectrum of people. And I think the other thing is from that comes our sense of the need to help those other people in our community that we can help. And we do everything that we can within our, resources that we have to try and do more. I think it really is the fact that we care. And we care about not just building houses or managing tenancies, but we care that people who live in our homes will actually do well and live well and be well. It's very hard to describe something that's so ingrained and so innate and such a strong part of our culture within our organisation. But I think the key thing is that we have a tagline more than a landlord, and I think that really says what we are. There's an interesting space that we work in, I think, that traditional tenancy management and the well-being, the social work support, and we're very strong in between, and that's often not recognised, that space. And that's the space where we will notice what's happening with people. If there's someone's been paying rent for fine and they all of a sudden stop, that's a trigger for us. If we go past a house and the rubbish is collecting more than, normal, one of the neighbours will tell us about a concern of somebody. I think that's what we do really well, is that space of looking and seeing and knowing. And I think that's because we care.
We often say amongst ourselves, the Salvation Army, the social housing area, we like providing tenancy with a heart, okay? So we want to provide long-term housing for people, but we also want to be involved in helping support them by providing, when necessary, sort of wraparound services so that we can support them not only through a house, but also support them through any issues that people are facing. And we also want to create community. We're a very individualistic sort of society. Not all of us know who our neighbours are, etc. And I think that's to our societal detriment, right? So what we say is that we believe that providing community is an important next step for people in terms of making people whole. We often talk about making people whole in the Salvation Army, and providing a house, providing community, providing ongoing care is really important to us. Our real focus is on that housing, creating community. Then we link, when people have needs, we link them to other social service providers or within the army. Okay, so, when you look at a lot of developments now, apartment complexes or whatever, they just focused on building the house, right? Which is an important thing. You can't put people there unless you have that house. But in all of our developments, we also add a community centre there, and that's where we'll have a staff member there, and we'll have a TV, we'll have coffee making machines, etc. And we invite the tenants, we call them our whānau, to be involved in community, and it's based out of that community centre. So if you went to any of our developments, our new developments now, you'd see houses, but you'd also see the focal point of it as a community hall. And that's where our staff are based. We run, or community groups run classes out of there. There might be English as a second language, there might be te reo lessons, etc. It's all active, all involved in trying to pull people in and trying to build this community in our developments.
Well, I think one of the key things in a housing system is that you've somehow got to link it to the local. You've got to allow communities to be engaged in the sort of housing that they want. If you go back to very early communities in New Zealand, Māori communities, without any benefit system or without any sort of government involvement, they actually looked after te whānau and built a community. And communities have got to continue to do that. They've got to be engaged with that. They can't have some body sort of coming in and saying, well, look, we're going to do this and we're going to do that. I mean, you can do that and it may work, but it's certainly not as good as actually allowing the community to take care of its. And I think that's what community housing organisations are able to do. They're often local people who are working in that situation and can understand what's going on, understand the dynamics, understand the politics, and can make a contribution. As against that, I was on the Kāingaora board, and I think in the staff that were in the Māori that were responsible, big development, big housing development on Māori, there was nobody in that working in that development that actually came out of Māori. They were all coming from other parts of the city. And so you've just got to say that, and the people who are making decisions about that also were not living in that community. Now, I mean, some of that's inevitable, but the more you can connect the community with what you're doing and what's going on and who's making the decisions, and a good housing system will do that. A good housing system, to be fair, organisations like Kāingaora have realised that and tried to do it and tried to put emphasis on place-based approach, but it's still limited in how effective that can be, because as against a community organisation which understands the community, which can talk to the plumber and the builder and all the rest of it.